So, I really want to make today's video for quite a long time now. After around 18 years, I feel like it's finally time for me to discuss why Prince of Persia Warrior Within remains one of my favourite and most endearing games of all time. To begin, let's rewind back to 2004. At this time in my life, my most played games would have been something like GTA Vice City or Tony Hawk's Underground, to name a couple of examples. But one lucky day, I was gifted the newly released Prince of Persia Warrior Within. So I popped that disc into my trusty PlayStation 2, connected it up to my 4x3 VHS TV combo thing, and since then I've played the game at least once a year. So based on the fact I've spent so much time in this game's world from such a young age, I feel like I've got a lot to say about it, and today I want to finally sit down and talk about why this game is so good. For those not familiar with the Sands of Time trilogy, I will be discussing spoilers, so you've been warned, but it's been nearly 20 years now, so what are you waiting for? So before we get to Warrior Within, start with Prince of Persia Sands of Time, which was a newly rebooted version of Prince of Persia, which originally launched back in 1989 as a 2D platformer. Ubisoft began a new trilogy with a time-travelling spin on the Prince, which introduced one of the most interesting game mechanics ever made. Beginning with the Sands of Time, we're introduced to the Prince who unknowingly releases the Sands of Time and has to scramble to fix his mistake. After doing so, Warrior Within picks up with the Prince and shows us that things didn't go quite to plan. Many years later, the Prince is pursued by a weird demon monster thing called the Dahaka, which is trying to correct the timeline after he should have died in the Sands of Time. So, this leads the Prince to travel to the Island of Time, where the Sands were originally created, in order to destroy them and make sure they were never created in the first place. So the story itself is one of my favourite aspects of the game. The universe that Sands of Time establishes gets a huge expansion, explains to us where the sands came from, how they were made, but most importantly, a greater sense of consequence. Throughout the game, the Prince is constantly trying to change his fate, but it always seems like it's one step forward and two steps back. After his initial attempt to stop the sands from being created, he inadvertently becomes the one that created it in the first place. After coming up with a solution to bring the sands into the present in order for not exist and be created in the past, you'd think that he's finally cracked it at this point. But with the canon ending, and yes, we're going to talk about both endings, the Prince still loses, which is a really interesting way of telling a story where you can't change anything no matter how hard you try. Tonally though, Warrior Within shifts pretty significantly from the original Arabian Nights style of Sands of Time with a more gothic feel. Now this did get a lot of criticism back at the time with its overly edgy look, but to me it just worked. Seeing the Prince as a more mature and traumatized character is much more interesting in my eyes compared to how he was in the Sands of Time, but I suppose with the more goofy nature of him in the previous one, that was kind of where some of the charm came from. This more mature representation is even more embodied by the introduction of the second character, Shadi, whose cultural impact can be summed up in one picture. Yeah, pretty much the classic female armor cliche, but there you go. As an antagonist goes, she's not too bad, but she doesn't get too much of a chance to shine besides the early game. But this is when we are introduced to the main antagonist, the Empress of Time, whose arc is fairly similar to the Prince's, and it's really interesting the way that they both overlap in the game. But both of these characters kind of fall into the forced edginess of the game a little bit more with their scantily clad design and looks. But yeah, you get the idea. But this more gothic look really lends itself amazingly to the actual island itself, which is one of the most interesting parts of the game overall. Due to the open worldish nature of the game and having to traverse areas in both the present and the past, we're shown two vastly different yet similar versions of the world. Stumbling upon a location and finding it in disarray after many years of wear and tear, but then coming back in the past and finding it in mint condition, is such an interesting design choice that provides a prior recognition, yet with a totally different feel that I haven't seen in many games to date. And how can you forget the music that fully encapsulates that edgy 2000s metal vibe? At times it got a little overbearing, but I think it did work, and when you are in certain combat scenarios, it really amped up the tension a lot. But also the soundtrack itself had this really spooky vibe to it, and when you're exploring the island on your own, it had a really solitary and somber feel to it. Before we go any further though, I am going to address my first criticism of the game, and that is the actual time travelling mechanic with the portals on the island, which in itself has an interesting puzzle to solve in order to first use the portal, where you have to run up walls in a certain sequence to activate buttons, but once you've done it once, it kind of gets a bit boring. Figuring out the exact sequence and running to actually match the buttons in the correct way can get really cumbersome at times, and just ruins the pace of the game overall. And I feel like once would be fine, but more than that is just pushing it a little bit. But back to the positives though. So most importantly, the one core feature that constantly brings me back to the game is the gameplay itself. Where Sands of Time excelled in terms of its hack and slash combat, platforming, and time travel mechanics, Warrior Within takes up a whole new level. While the basic combat mechanics remain largely the same, Warrior Within introduces a load of combos which can really add a lot of variety to fights and make you come up with new interesting ways to beat your enemies. As well as being able to use a side weapon, which is brand new in Warrior Within, and it means that you can do even more crazy and wild combos. Again, with the platforming, we've got the usual assortment of traps which the prince has to traverse through, but progressively these traps do get really challenging, and the way that the prince actually interacts with the environment is really cool to see, with the climbing and wall running and jumping over obstacles. This is even more applicable when it comes to life upgrades, which has some of the toughest obstacles to get through in order to actually get a bonus which will increase your overall health bar. And if you collect all the life upgrades, you then get to claim the water sword, which is very important for the canon ending. I always love revisiting these life upgrades, but in terms of things that you can collect as a side part of the game, being able to collect the concept art and even weapons is a really interesting way to make you explore the game even more. Of course, it wouldn't be a Prince of Persia game without the time travel mechanics, and the rewinding and slowing of time is really useful in certain combat and also for when you're platforming and make a mistake, but there are also some new powers you get as well, which are really useful. I seriously never get tired of the rewind mechanic though. Back when Sands of Times introduced this, it was a total game changer, but you could argue that it was a bit of a way for the game to hold your hand a little bit, but for me, it was such a good way to keep the tension up and ensure the pacing just kept going as you get through the game. There's nothing like a sticky situation where you're stuck on your last sand tank and you're having to rely on that in order to actually get through the level, and if you fail, you're going all the way back to your checkpoint. Speaking of sticky situations, there's parts of the game where the Dahaka just shows up out of nowhere and you're forced to run for your life. These chases are really intense, and the camera angles really make it difficult to tell just how close he is to you. And when you catch a sneak peek of a tentacle popping around the corner, or he just jumps out at you, it really adds the tension and kicks things up a notch. You know what really put Warrior Within on another level for me though? The Sandwraith section. So after the prince's first attempt to change his fate, he defeats the Empress and travels back to the present, but finds that the Dahaka is still chasing him. After some moping about, the prince discovers the Mask of the Wraith, which allows the host to exist in the same timeline as their past self and take their place upon their death. So first off, that's a really dark but interesting concept in itself, but it also introduces a new gameplay mechanic where you can replenish your sand tanks over time, but you also lose health progressively even if you're not getting damaged by any enemies. Which in itself really keeps the pacing moving forward because you cannot stop, otherwise you will just die and fail. Seeing that health bar drop and not panicking while they're trying to get through a combat scenario or a platforming section really adds to the actual drama of the game. And the actual transformation sequence is really cool. Bit creepy, but when you suddenly realise that the actual Sandwraith creature has been pursuing the prince from the very beginning of the game, it's one of the best twists I've seen in a game. Something about the prince becoming a demonic thing just adds to the strangeness of the game, and I just love it even more. And of course, one of the cool aspects of the game is that it actually has two endings. The normal ending basically has the prince bring the Empress into the present where she's consumed by the Dahaka, and then the prince travels back to Persia where he finds it in flames, with a voiceover saying about not being able to change your fate. But going back to the life upgrades I mentioned earlier on, if you get all of those along with the water sword, you then take the Empress into the present where you try and make amends, and then the Dahaka shows up and you actually have a fight with him with the water sword. This in itself is a really awesome change considering how much you get chased by the Dahaka earlier in the game, and this time you can actually defend yourself, which is awesome. You then beat the Dahaka, and the prince makes amends with the Empress, who actually leaves the island with him for Persia. We then get a bit of a weird sex scene that I'll skim over here for now, but either way, that happened. But ultimately, the ending remains the same, and we still see Persia in flames and in ruin, with the same voiceover saying about not being able to change your fate. Now, the sequel to Thrones does actually confirm that this ending is canon, but the whole process of going through and collecting the life upgrades in order to even get the real ending is a really awesome prospect. So, why am I still talking about this game 18 years later? Besides me being a sucker for nostalgia, Warrior Within fully encapsulated a time in my life where it was competing closely with games like God of War or Devil May Cry, and with the open world-ish nature of the game, that was slightly overshadowed at the time by a game like San Andreas. For me, there was just nothing like it. My childlike brain could just simply not comprehend the nature of the game with it being such a unique design in terms of its story and characters and world design. Now, not everything has aged as well over time, and I have thankfully been able to make some fixes myself with widescreen support and being able to run it at 4K, but other parts of the game are not looking as good. On most playthroughs I'll encounter out of sync dialogue, or sometimes object collusion just isn't there, or I'll even see static flames that don't seem to do anything at all. And also, I don't know why, but the prince's teeth look really weird in this game. No, I'm not a graphics snob by any means, but it is still a little bit off-putting. But regardless, the actual gameplay experience of it is still pretty smooth to this day, and if you're willing to put up with a couple of issues here and there, you're going to have a great time. I just love this game, and like I said, I've played this game at least once a year since 2004, and I've seen myself continuing it for quite some time now. And along with the rest of the Sands of Time trilogy, it's still a really good game, and you can still get it really cheap and discounted on Steam, so I'd highly recommend checking out if you've never played it before. Either way, I'm really happy that I've managed to have a chance to sit down and talk about this game with you guys, but let me know what you thought of Warrior Within, or just what you thought of this video in general. If you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to like and subscribe. This is my first kind of video like this, and I am hoping to do another one like it in the future, but let me know what you thought of it, as I'd really like to know. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.